Hello, and thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Ian Scott, and I am the founder of Scott Legal. Today, we are going to speak a little bit about the E-2 visa, and we are going to speak about the E-2 visa in particular when the case has risk elements associated with it. So we're going to focus on some of those risk elements and, give you some suggestions as well as to how to deal with some of those risks if and when they come up. Some housekeeping things before we get started. Scott Legal is a full-service immigration firm. We do a lot of E-2 visas, and we happen to be a firm that was founded on an E-2 visa. So I am in the United States on an E-2 visa, so know what you are going through and really can empathize and available for any questions that you have. In terms of the presentation or the webinar, we will record it and we will send the webinar out to everyone after the meeting, and we'll also send a number of other things. We'll send an E-2 visa guide, which will show a lot of the E-2 visa requirements that we're going to go through today. We'll also send you a link to where you can see the actual webinar on YouTube, and we'll also send you some information on how you can set up a consultation if you would like to receive our services. Now, the other thing that other housekeeping item is questions. So we will get a chance to answer all questions. I see that some questions are already in the Q&A box. You can add the questions in the Q&A box or the chat box. We will get to them in due course. We always save time at the end, or sometimes as we're going through the presentation to answer questions. We are joined by Michaela Vrazdova, who's an E-2 visa attorney at the firm as well. So we're going to split up the presentation. And so we are, fortunate to have her here with us. She's processed a large number of E-2 visas, both at U.S. consulates abroad and through USCIS. So without further ado, let us get started. So, we'll just jump right into the E-2 visa requirements. So first and foremost, and, we almost call this a threshold issue, you have to be a national of a treaty country. And what that means is that you have to have a passport from that country. Now, the reason we say treaty country is because the U.S. has agreements or treaties between a number of countries. There are about 80 of them on the list, and you do have to have a passport from that country. The country of birth is not important, but having a passport from the country is what is guiding. And when we say countries all over the world, the 80 countries that are represented, they are really all over the world. We have treaty countries in Africa, we have treaty countries in Europe, we have treaty countries in all continents except Antarctica. So really kind of a large number of countries that are available across the globe. So when you are looking at applying for an E-2 investor visa, the company that is going to be the E-2 company must be at least 50% owned by nationals of the treaty country. So, for that, we just, in terms of the evidence that we show, is if there's a corporation or if there's an LLC, then we're going to show the ownership documents that show that nationals of the treaty country own at least 50%. And if you are the investor, then you personally would have to own 50% of the company and invest in that particular company as well. So the other big piece of the E-2 visa is that you have to make an investment. It is an investor visa, and this is a tough one because the investment has to be made before you actually get the visa. So it's one of the questions that we often get. Can I go into this, and how can I go into this when I don't know if I'm going to get the visa? How can I spend all this money and set up a business and I don't know if I'm going to get this visa? But unfortunately, the funds do have to be at risk, and that means that money has actually been spent, not sitting in a bank account. So you couldn't just set up an entity and put money in a bank account and then apply for an E-2 visa, because it would likely just be denied. When you are investing, you do have to show the government where the money came from. You have to prove that it came from a legitimate source. Gifts are fine, loans are fine. The only loan that could be problematic is if the loan is secured by the assets of the business, but an unsecured loan is fine, or a loan secured against your personal property. is also fine in terms of a source of funds. We tend to, when we apply at consulates, we tend not to provide that much documentation related to where the money came from. And sometimes we will ask applicants to bring the information to the consulate with them. In contrast, though, if you are applying through USCIS, if you're in the US and you're applying through USCIS, the source of funds analysis is going to be quite extensive. We are going to spend some more time talking, some other slides talking about how much you have to invest. The regulations really just say that the investment has to be substantial. And the amount of the investment is really going to depend on the nature of the business. So we will talk about that in more detail. We have a whole slide dedicated to that. And I see one of the questions that has come in has to do with the minimum requirements. We have a number of questions that have already come in through the chat and Q&A. So the other thing and we are going to talk a little bit more about E-2 visa expenditures, but as I said earlier, you are going to actually have to spend the money before you apply, and you're going to spend it on things like inventory, equipment, employees, rent, legal fees, a lot of other expenditures. So really, you're going to be spending everything that's required to get that particular business up and running. You can also get an E-2 visa if you were purchasing a business. So let's say that there was a restaurant and you paid the seller $300,000 or $400,000 to purchase the restaurant. That would be fine as well in terms of meeting the substantial investment requirement because you actually purchased the entire business. We have a note on the slide about escrow. Sometimes that will come into play if you are purchasing a business, because if you the regulations will permit that you purchase a business, and instead of giving the seller the money, when you don't know if you're going to get the visa, instead of giving the seller the money, you can have a condition you put the money in escrow and have a condition in the escrow agreement that in essence says that if the visa is not approved, then the money is going to go back to the buyer, and if the visa is approved, then the money is going to go to the seller. So that can be the only condition in the escrow agreement, but that is actually possible if you're purchasing the business, because the government understands that you might be in a position where you purchase the business and don't get the visa, and then you'd have to worry about kind of getting the money back from the seller, which would be difficult. The other big part of, because if I had to break E-2 visas into two main parts, one is investment. That's what, a lot of what we just talked about. And the other big part of an E-2 visa has to do with hiring U.S. workers. So the statute refers to this as a business cannot be marginal. And what that means is a business cannot be a business that just supports the primary applicant, the investor, and his or her family. So what that really translates to, though, is hiring U.S. workers. And again, just like the investment amount, there's no specific number of U.S. workers that is indicated in the regulations, but we generally say that after a 5-year period, you want to see the equivalent of 3 full-time workers. Generally speaking, that's what we say, but that could vary depending on the facts and circumstances. The business should be real and operating. It should be as close to being up and running as possible. It can already be taking in revenue if you have employees that are in the United States, or it's possible to run the business while you're not in the United States. Then, but really, we had a situation a while ago where the person was opening up a gym in Arizona, and when she went to her interview, the officer asked her, "What would I see if I went to the gym right now?" And she said, "The equipment's there, it's leased, the employees are there. The only thing that it's waiting for is for me to get the visa." And that's really what the officer was waiting to hear, right? Because you do want to be as close to operations as possible, so that they don't think that the business endeavor is a speculative or a mere intent to start a business. You are required to come to solely to develop and direct the operations. That's usually satisfied by owning 50% of the business, but we also look to people's experience and just to assess that they are actually going to be able to do the business. If they don't have experience doing that particular business, then we might explain that experience is something that they could learn on the job or something like that. So And then you have to have the intent to return to your home country, and usually this is just satisfied with a statement that indicates that you plan on returning to your home country once the visa expires. But the visa, like if you get an E-2 visa, you can renew it, right? So if you get an E-2 visa and it's approved for 5 years, then after the E-2 visa period runs out, you can renew it, and you can get another 5 years, and you can really do that indefinitely. So the E-2 visa is a visa that really can allow you to stay in the U.S. for an extended period of time. I've renewed my E-2 visa twice already. And it's really the visa that I plan on utilizing while staying in the States for the long term. So that's something to keep in mind. So the next thing we're going to talk about is who can apply for an E-2 visa, and how long does an E-2 visa last. So we talked about kind of the who can apply, and we talked a lot already about the different countries. We have on the slide kind of some examples of continents that and areas where applicants are able to apply, just to kind of rhyme off a few countries. Japan is an E-2 country, Korea, Australia, South Korea, Australia. We have Canada, Mexico. We have Egypt, we have Bangladesh. So really a large number of the UK, really a large number of countries that are E-2 visa countries. Now, when we move to the question of how long can an E-2 visa be valid for, that's an interesting question, because the time really depends on which country. A few factors. One is which country you're from. And what I mean by that is that there is a table, it's called a reciprocity table, which lists all of the E-2 visa countries and then talks about how long the E-2 visa can be issued for that particular country. So, and you'll see from the slide that the timing can be between 3 months and 5 years. So if you're from a national from Canada or the UK, you can get 5 years. If you're a national from Australia, it would be 4 years. If you're a national from Bangladesh or Egypt, though, then the visa can only be issued for 3 months. Now, the visa is an entry document only. So the fact that it's issued for 3 months, when it's issued for 3 months, when you enter the United States, you'll be given 2 years in valid E-2 status that will allow you to stay and live and work in the US while you run your business for that 2-year period. But then if you left the US during that period, if it was a single entry visa, if you left the US during that period, you would need a new visa to re-enter. So you'd have to go back to the consulate and get a new visa. But you could stay in the United States, and you could even extend your E-2 visa in the United States without an issue, as long as you are otherwise meeting the E-2 visa requirements, which hiring US workers is going to be the main one that's going to be associated with an actual renewal. So I said earlier that we're going to talk about, how much to invest, how much investment is enough. So I think that one of the things that I often encourage people to try and stay away from is, kind of coming up with just an absolute dollar amount, right? Like how, to tell me, sometimes clients tell me a number that I have to invest, and there is no dollar amount. Instead, what we look at is one of the first things that we look at is the type of business. So we have to look at the type of business and then make an assessment as to what is the total amount that's going to be required to get this particular type of business fully up and running. Right now, if it's a service-oriented business, we know that a service-oriented business can be up and running for very little money, maybe $3,000, $5,000. However, if you are applying at a consulate, the government is not going to accept such a low investment amount, right? So the fact is that if you do have a business that does not have doesn't have high startup costs, often you're going to be in the situation where you are spending money that you really otherwise wouldn't have spent. And I had to do that even for my own E-2 visa. I signed an irrevocable 1-year lease of $1,700 a month. And I didn't need it. I didn't need the lease. I didn't have any clients. I didn't need the lease at all. But I was able to include the 2 months that I had paid for the security deposit and the rent, I was able to include that in my investment amount. So it was able to increase the investment amount to a level that the government found satisfactory. So so there is, unfortunately, that situation where you have to, in some instances, you have to spend money that you wouldn't have otherwise spent. Now, the other thing to kind of consider with respect to investment amount is that the amount of the investment is not just going to be based on the type of business, but often you're going to look at other factors. So one factor might be what type of business is it, and and specifically what other factors associated with that business make it a strong case. So, good example, we had a applicant that was opening up a doctor's office, and she had only spent around $20,000 or so, but if she had already millions of dollars worth of contracts from this insurance company. So you could see that the business was going to be a very lucrative one. And everyone has the vision, including the officers, that when they go into doctors' offices, there are always a bunch of people working there. So it was easy to visualize that that business was going to be able to hire US workers. So we do want to look at some of the other factors. It could be that the business already has employees. So that would be another factor that is very, very strong. One of the other things that can strengthen a case is if you have a CPA write a letter, right? We usually don't do this in the first instance, but sometimes if a client gets denied, we might get a CPA to write a letter that indicates that they've spent everything that's required for this particular business to get that business up and running. In terms of amounts, we generally say that applicants should be spending over $50,000-$60,000 in terms of getting an E-2, in terms of and some, unfortunately, the other kind of thing that you have to consider is some consulates won't even accept that. Some consulates are very, very stuck in investment should be 100,000, 200,000, or maybe even more to meet the substantial requirement. And unfortunately, the adjudication is not consistent across consulates. So sometimes when we are applying at a consulate, in particular a consulate that maybe is not, doesn't do that many E-2s, we do reach out to our colleagues to kind of get the latest with respect to what that consulate is doing, because consular officers are moved around quite a bit, and when they are moved around, that means that the rules or the way that things are adjudicated may in fact change in based on that. So so I think that again, this is an area that it's probably the single largest number of people ask this question, right? Like how much do I have to invest? But it really is you really are going to have to take into a number of factors. But at the end of the day, the more you spend, the better in terms of the improving the chances of success of your case. And then one other side note is that if you're in the US on a B1 visa, and then you decide to do a change of status, then that is an instance when you can spend a lot less, right? So the government, when you are doing a change of status, USCIS is not going to be nearly as phased by a low investment, even an investment of $15,000 or $20,000, if you can show that you've spent in all of the areas necessary to get that particular business up and running. So that's something to keep in mind when if you are in the United States, and that because if you live in a country where the consulate is going to, it only accepts higher investment amounts, and you don't have the money, you don't have that, then, a change of status might be an option for you. So some of these things we've touched on a little bit, but when you do have kind of a low, because when we talk about risky cases, like one risky case is if you have a application with an actual low investment amount, and as I mentioned in the last slide, one of the things you're always going to look at is what's the overall strength of the E-2 application? Like, again, do you have employees? Do you have contracts or letters of intent that from clients that show that your business is going to be viable? Often the Chamber of Commerce will write a letter on your behalf that says that we looked at this person's business plan, and we believe that the business is going to support U.S. jobs in our region, right? So those are very compelling letters as well. And we always say the same thing from clients. Oh, they won't write anything, but then if you press them even a little bit, maybe even give them a sample or something, they will in fact write it. Usually if the business is a startup business, there is going to be a business plan that is drafted. So, a strong business plan is very helpful. A lot of the consulates have page limits these days. So the strong business plan is helpful, but often you might be bringing pieces of it to the interview. But you definitely want a very strong executive summary, because even if there's a page limit, you're going to have the executive summary and maybe the personnel plan and the income statement in the package, because the government is going to be interested in those key elements, right? So let's look at these examples. The first one, you're opening a business and the investment amount is low, but you've already hired a couple of workers and taking in revenue, and you have around 10 clients. Well, so that's a good case, right? That's, even if your investment amount is really low, that's a good case. But then, but example two is what we often see, applying for an E-2 visa. They haven't spent very much money and they don't want to spend any more money, and they want to do it they want to spend the money after, but that's a recipe for denial, really. And you don't want to be in a position of having to reapply. It's always going to be harder to get the E-2 visa if you have been denied once. It's always going to be harder to get the E-2 visa. So when we look at common E-2 visa expenditures, and we break E-2 visa expenditures into, not all expenditures are created equally, and the ones listed on this page are pretty good E-2 visa expenditures. Whereas the next slide then I'll turn to, they're not so good, right? So but everything on this page, the only one I'd say that we have to be careful with is training courses, because we only think, that's why you say restrictions apply. The only training courses would be discrete training courses that very short amount of time. Otherwise it kind of seems like education, right? I mean, I was opening up a law firm for my E-2 visa, and I could hardly argue that I could include the cost of my tuition to go to law school in the in the actual expenditure list. So and then when we look at bad E-2 expenditures like travel, any type of hotels, meals, we see people including, Chipotle receipts, McDonald's, other meals and things like that. And all of these are not things that consulates are very interested in. The other thing, expenditure to mention, is cars or vehicles. They can be a good E-2 visa expense if they are required for the business. So if you have a home renovation business, then having a truck, or like a landscaping business, having a truck and tools and equipment and things like that, that's all going to be relevant. However, if you have a consulting business and then you say your primary expense is a car, then even the IRS wouldn't let you deduct money for that. So that's not a good one. So I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Michaela to go through the next few slides.
Thank you so much, Ian, and good morning, everyone. So yeah, let's look at some challenges that come up if you are applying for an E-2 for a consulting company. So the issue with kind of like consulting companies is that theoretically a very low investment amount may be sufficient to start a consulting company. So for example, you can just buy a laptop, or you may even already have a laptop. You can set up a website, and then you can argue that you don't really need anything else to kind of like run the company. But for the E-2 visa, this will not be sufficient. So for the E-2 visa, as Ian already discussed, you have to make kind of the upfront substantial investment, and you have to show that you are committed to successfully run the company in the US. So you can also kind of like look at this situation. So if you spend like $3,000-4,000 and you are arguing that you spend everything you needed to kind of like get the consulting business up and running, you can also kind of like put yourself in the shoes of the consular officer and just kind of like look at the situation, like, you know, like what will the consular officer think if you are arguing that kind of like, you know, this is a substantial amount. So kind of like the key is that you know, even for a consulting businesses where the argument can be made that, you know, potentially kind of like a lower and you know, you only need to spend so little money, you know, for the E-2 visa, you will have to show that you kind of like made that upfront substantial investment, because you will have to show that you are committed to kind of like operate the business in the US. So what kind of expenditures, you know, you can include if you are starting a consulting business? So you can include any money you spend to kind of like pay for the office rent. So for example, if you prepay your office space for 6 or 12 months, you can include all this money as part of your E-2 investment. So let's say that you prepay $25,000 for an office space. This can all be part of your E-2 investment. And we have kind of like, we see this a lot when people have kind of like issues and they don't really know like what to spend money on. Often they do prepay the rent for several months because that will kind of increase their investment amount. The next thing is equipment. So basically any kind of equipment you buy, so any computer equipment, you know, laptop, scanner, printer, you need for yourself or for your future employees. You can include all of this as part of your E-2 investment. You can invest in marketing. So this can be, for example, any money you pay for a website, you know, Google ads, things like that, or any money you pay to a marketing company to kind of like help you market the enterprise in the US. And also, you know, any money you pay to employees can be included as part of your E-2 investment. So let's say that you are outside the US, you are starting this business and you already have some clients in the US and you hire an employee who will be kind of serving the clients. You can include kind of like any money you pay to this employee as part of your E-2 investment, and this will help you to kind of increase the E-2 investment amount, but it will also help you in the sense that you will be able to show that you already have a US employee working in the US, and that will kind of help to meet the marginality requirement. Perfect. So now let's move and just kind of look at some challenges that come up if you are starting a business in the real estate industry. So, you know, some companies in the real estate industries can qualify for, you know, the E-2 visa, but some may not. So, you know, one question that we often get is, you know, can I buy, you know, can I purchase a property in the US, you know, for a couple millions of dollars and put it in an LLC? Can this, you know, can I get an E-2 visa through this? And so the answer to this question is no, you know, because in this case, it's really just kind of like you are purchasing a property, you know, it's just kind of like a passive investment in the US. Even if you are kind of like renting the property, the rent is just kind of like a passive income you are collecting in the US. And for the E-2 visa, what you have to show is that the E-2 company is kind of active, real, and operating enterprise that, you know, that has employees and that either, you know, sell products or provides some sort of services to people in the US. So, you know, some types of companies we have done E-2 visas for successfully are, for example, real estate brokerage firms, real estate management companies. For real estate management companies, you know, we usually recommend that you know, let's say that you own like 50 or, you know, 100 properties in the US. You know, the E-2 visa could be done for kind of like, you know, that company that only kind of like owns the, you know, its own properties, but we usually kind of like recommend that the company manages other properties as well, the properties it doesn't own, if possible. Another type could be real estate, kind of like renovation or a construction company. So we have done a lot of E-2 visas for these. And we have also done E-2 visas for house flipping companies. In this case, it's just going to be important to show that the company is doing kind of like the house flipping on a large scale. So you would want to show that the company flips like 50 or 100 properties per year, and not kind of like 1, 2, 3 properties, because in that case that would probably not be there would not be a strong E2 case. One other thing I just wanted to mention in kind of like the E2 companies in the real estate industry is that usually this industry is kind of like highly regulated, so the company will need some sort of license to operate. So you should kind of like look into like if you need to apply for a license on kind of like the state level, county level, city level, because usually mostly I would say USCIS focuses on this a lot, and they may issue a request for evidence and ask for the relevant licenses. So you want to kind of like investigate what needs to be kind of like acquired for you to be able to operate this type of business in this particular area, before applying for the E-2 visa. Perfect. So now let's look at kind of like the E-2 visa. And if you can get an E-2 visa if you are starting an equity trading company. So the answer is yes, but again, it has some limitations. If you are only placing your stock portfolio in the name of an LLC and you want to get an E-2 visa for this LLC, that would not be a strong E-2 case. For this type of business, you really want to show that or the company will have clients other than you and your kind of like friends and family, and will be kind of doing this on a large scale. So to be able to show that this is going to be kind of like, again, like an active, real and operating business. So you would want to demonstrate in the business plan that that you will be able to get client outside your family and friends. And another thing kind of like similar as kind of like in the real estate industry is that this is a highly regulated industry, so you want to kind of like investigate what again, like city, county, state, federal licenses potentially you need to kind of operate this type of enterprise. Perfect. So now let's look at some common reasons for E-2 denials. So I would say one common reason is that the E-2 investment amount is just too low, and we kind of see this a lot. When people come to us after their they submitted their E-2 petition kind of like themselves without an attorney at a consulate, and the investment amount was they spend like $5,000-$10,000, and then they had like $80,000 sitting on a bank account. So that obviously, as we kind of already discussed, that would be an extremely weak E-2 case, just because one of the requirements is that you have to show that the money is at risk, the money was already spent before you applied for an E-2 visa. So that is one of the reasons we often see that the investment amount was just kind of really low, was only couple $1,000. So in that case, we usually recommend that additional money is kind of like invested in the business, is spent, and then we have done it in a lot of cases. We thereafter kind of like reapplied at the same consulate or at a different consulate, and the E-2 visa petition was thereafter approved. So that's kind of like one general comment about E-2 visa denials is that even if your E-2 visa is denied the first time, depending on the reason for the denial, you can always kind of reapply. You just kind of like have to address the concern of the officer. So, if you originally applied and you only spent $5,000, but then in the reapplication, you show that you spent additional $50,000, the case may, still be approved the second time, and you may get the E-2 visa the second time. The other kind of reason for denial can be just kind of like the nature of the business. So as I said, some people think that if they just kind of like purchase a property in the US and put it in LLC and just kind of show that they spend $2-3 million in the US, that they qualify for an E-2 visa. So that would, as we discussed, that would not be the case, just because the business is passive. There is just kind of like the company is not providing any services, is not selling anything. The LLC doesn't have any employees. Another reason for denial may be just the kind of like the nature of the business you are starting in the US, and that we would kind of want to restructure the business before reapplying. Another reason for denial may be the filing location or venue. So there are some consulates that just kind of want to see large investment amounts, or kind of like better said, some consular officers at certain posts are used to seeing only, that the companies are investing like $200,000 at least. So this is, for example, the US consulate in Japan. They are just kind of like used to see in Tokyo, they're used to see like very large investment amounts. So if you would be applying at that consulate and you only spend, like $50,000, then you have like $20,000-$30,000 on the company's account as working capital. Your application, could be denied, just because that consulate is usually seeing kind of like much larger investment amounts, but that same application could well be approved in, for example, at the US consulate in Toronto or at some other consulate. So, I would say it's always good to engage an experienced immigration attorney to just kind of like discuss, like what is the best filing location for a case. Another kind of like reason for denial could be that you have a business in your home country and that business has no employees. So, let's say that you are, you have had a consulting business in your home country for the last 5 years, and you never hired any employee for that business, and you have been kind of like operating yourself. You have been the main consultant. And now you are starting a consulting business in the US, and you are submitting a business plan and saying that you will hire, five full-time employees in the next 5 years. So I would say, in this case, the consulate just, they could ask you questions, and they could just have doubts like whether this business in the US will be able to hire that many employees, if you never hired employees in your home country. Of course, you can always kind of explain, like why the new business in the US will be kind of like doing the operations on larger scales, like how that business will be able to hire all these employees. But we have seen it that, because as part of the E-2 visa application, you are submitting your CV. And if the consular officer sees that, like you own or you have owned a business in the past, they often do ask about kind of the revenue of the business in your home country, and about kind of like how many employees in your home country have you hired. So, if you hired 0, that and kind of like the revenues were very low, that could potentially be a reason for denial. Another kind of like reason for denial could be that the consular officer just doesn't think that the business will be able to create jobs for US workers. So this is, for example, if your kind of revenue projections, if you're starting a new business and the revenue projections are kind of like, you know, on the lower side. You know, the officer could just have concerns, you know, whether you'll be able to hire US employees. Another reason can be, you know, if you have issues with adjudicating officer. You know, I would say like this sometimes comes up if you in the past, you know, like let's say that you were denied some other visa and the interview just didn't go well. You know, the officer may have put some notes in the system, and you know, that kind of stays there. So the next time you apply for another visa, you know, it may be denied, but you know, this is not always the case. Like we have had many people who have kind of like visas denied in the past, and then you know, like when they apply for an E-2 visa, you know, it's approved. And then you know, another reason for denial may be that you just kind of like didn't meet the requirements at the time of filing. So this we usually see this, you know, when people kind of file E-2 applications themselves without an attorney. You know, so for example, if you only own like 25% in a US company and you are applying for an E-2 visa as the E-2 investor, and you know, the other 75% is, let's say, owned by US citizens, you know, you just kind of like don't meet the threshold E-2 requirement of owning at least 50%. So you know, that could be a reason for, or that would be the reason for denial. Perfect. So now let's move on to E-2 visa adjudication trends and hot topics. So you know, does you know, does COVID, you know, still have impact on kind of issuance of E-2 visas? So I would say that the vast majority of consulates, you know, they are kind of beyond the COVID backlog, and the processing times are you know, like almost the same as they used to be before COVID. There are still some consulates that are extremely, you know, backlogged, but I would say the vast majority of the consulates are accepting E-2 visa applications and processing them, you know, almost the same speed as they used to before COVID. You know, one thing we kind of have seen that kind of like was happening a lot during COVID was that a lot of people were extending or changing their status in the US rather than applying at consulates. And I can just kind of like generally go through you know, the two options you basically have. So you know, if you are already in the US on some valid non-immigrant status, you could potentially change your status with USCIS. This would not be possible if you enter on ESTA. So if you enter on ESTA, you would not have this option. But let's say that you enter as a B1 or B2 visitor, you could potentially change your status in the US. So, you know, the advantage of this process is, for example, that if you pay for a premium processing, you could have a decision within 15 days. And once you have an approval, you can kind of start operating the company. So, you know, I would say like probably the biggest advantage of this process is that you can get a decision pretty quickly. But then there are some other things you should consider, you know, before deciding to do change of status. You know, one thing is that USCIS is just kind of extremely focused and just kind of like picky about what documents they want to see about the source and trail of funds. So as Ian mentioned, you know, if you are applying at a consulate, you know, the source and trail of funds documents, you know, we usually just kind of like recommend that you bring them to the interview, or we just kind of include very light documentation about that. With USCIS, you know, you will have to kind of show, you know, like what's the source of the funds you are investing, like how the funds were transferred in the US. You know, let's say that the money comes from your salary earnings, you know, they will want to see that you accumulated the funds on your bank account. So it just kind of, if you do decide to apply with USCIS, they just kind of like want to see a lot of documents about the source and trail of funds. Another kind of like disadvantage of this process is that, you will only get 2-year E-2 status in the US. And then if you decide to leave, you would have to apply for an E-2 visa at a consulate anyway. So a lot of people kind of like prefer to apply for an E-2 visa in their home country because it just kind of gives them ability to travel internationally. But as I said, some people prefer to do the change of status, if they just kind of don't travel, if they know that they will stay here. So it would just kind of depend on your particular situation and the facts of your case. And one other big advantage of USCIS filings, as Ian already mentioned, is that we have had petitions where the investment amount was $20,000 and they were approved by USCIS, and they would never be approved at certain consulates, or I would say at most consulates abroad. Perfect. So now let's just discuss some issues and complex areas that come up with E-2 visas. So one question we often get is if you have to hire employees before you apply for an E-2 visa. So the answer is, it's not required that you hire employees, but it definitely helps your application if you do have at least one employee, even if it's a part-time employee, before you file the petition. So another issue, and I just kind of like went over that, is the complicated source and trail of funds. So as I mentioned, for USCIS filings, you would have to submit kind of like much more documentation about this. We often get asked whether loans and gifts are permitted. So both of them are permitted for the E-2 visa. Just one issue with loans is that the loan cannot be secured by the assets of the E-2 company. But other than that, loans are generally fine for an E-2 visa. Another issue that sometimes comes up is, can you apply for an E-2 visa with your kind of business partner and own the business 50-50, and both of you would get E-2 investor visa? So the answer is yes. This is allowed. Just two things to keep in mind. You would each want to invest kind of the same, or almost the same amount in the E-2 company, and then you would have to show that each of you has kind of like high-level executive or managerial role in the company. Another thing that sometimes comes up after the E-2 visa is issued is, that there are some kind of changes to the E-2 business after the E-2 visa is approved. So if there is a change in the ownership, changes in ownership are generally fine. But you always have to keep at least 50% in the E-2 company. So let's say that you originally owned 100%, but then you sell 30%, but you still own 70%. So this would be fine. And the other type of change is kind of change in the type of business. So changes kind of, if you decide that you want to kind of like provide additional services, other than the ones kind of like you mentioned in the original application. So I would say, some changes are fine, some are not. If kind of, the additional services you will start providing are still related to the original activity, those are fine. But let's say that you got an E-2 visa for a consulting company, and consulting company in like IT industry, and now you want to purchase a restaurant in the US, then for this type of change, you would have to go back to the consulate or back to USCIS and just kind of let them know about this additional kind of service offering you want to do, and then you would need to get an approval before you start this kind of before this change happens. And last thing I wanted to mention is family business purchases. So we often get a question, can I buy a business from a family member in the US? And the answer is that there is nothing in the regulation that prohibits you from this, but these types of applications are generally kind of much more scrutinized by the consulates and USCIS. And one thing you just kind of like you would want to show is that you paid kind of fair market value for the business you are buying. So you would just kind of want to submit an evaluation, showing that you paid, I don't know, $100,000, and the fair market value of the business was $100,000 with the E-2 visa application.
Perfect. No, thank you very much, Michaela. That's a great information. And we do have a number of questions. So let me pull those up. Just give me 1 second. Great. Okay. So there's one question that has to do with, and I think that Michaela answered this when she talked about change of status, but one person was interested in coming to the US, on a B1, B2 and changing status. And the applicant is actually from Bangladesh. So that's an interesting, I'll explain why it's an interesting question, in particular for nationals of Bangladesh. So nationals of Bangladesh are only eligible for a visa for 3 months. So 3 months single entry. So if you enter the United States, you're given 2 years in E2 status, but you can't kind of come and go the same way that someone that, like a Canadian, for example, could come and go, because they'd be issued a visa for 5 years. So for nationals of Bangladesh, changing status is really the same as getting the visa at the consulate. If you're in the United States and you change status, you're given the status for 2 years and you can't travel. If you get the visa at the consulate, you get the visa and you enter and you can't travel. And when you travel, you have to go to the consulate and get it renewed. So if you are in the United States, changing status is definitely an option for you. And then Michaela went over kind of the differences between changing status and a consulate. So what about friends into our account? I'm not really sure what that means. Does it matter? Does it matter if one question is, does it matter if the investment is over several months, or does it have to be in one lump sum? It can definitely be over time. There's no requirement that it's one lump sum. We do advise that sometimes if you're not a treaty national, when you make the investment, that could be a problem. Like if someone's getting a passport, we have one client that they're from Ireland. They're going to be able to get an Irish passport, but what we advise them is that don't make the investment until you actually have the passport. Because we've heard consular officers complaining about that in the past, but generally speaking, you can make investments over time. There's another question. Can you explain the benefits of consular processing or change of status for lower investment amounts? I think Michaela covered that quite well when she talked about that in the last slide. Do you need a physical office for an E2? It's a great question. So you don't need it, but we highly recommend it. So we, consular officers think lease shows that you're serious, and the lease should be commercial. It shouldn't be like, in a home and things like that. So we do think we highly recommend it. 99% of our clients get lease. In fact, we've only had a few applications where they opted not to get a lease. If the U.S. government is already if the U.S. company is already generating revenue, but it is low investment amount, can the company? Yeah, so this is a great question. If the U.S. company is already generating revenue, but it is a low investment amount, can the company's revenue be taken into consideration when it comes to the government assessing expenditures? So the answer to that question is no. Investment is not made up of company revenue. Investment has to be money that you have taken and invested and put in the company. So if you take two examples, you say one example where someone put $50,000 in a business bank account and spent it, then all of that can be investment. But let's say the person didn't put anything in a bank account, started a business, made $50,000 and spent it, then zero of that is investment. So that's a great question. It comes up often, but your investment has to be money that you've put in the company. Our U.S. business is a social enterprise funded by membership and crowdfunding from our email list. Would that create an issue as a nature of business for E2? I think it would create an issue. I think that it's, I think it's, we'd have to see the structure of what's making up the crowdfunding and who owns the company and things like that. But I think that I think that it could be an issue. Timeline, consular timelines for the meeting. It really depends on the consulate. Every consulate's going to be, some are going to be almost immediate and some are going to be months. Change of status, you can pay the government $2,500 to have your petition adjudicated within 2 weeks. So that's the timing for that. Perfect. So that answers all of the questions. And again, there was a question in here as well about getting a transcript for this, but we don't have a transcript for it. But what we do have is this has been recorded and we do turn it into a video and we post it on our YouTube channel. And we actually will send you an email with the recording, with the guide, with the information related to setting up a consultation. So you'll have that all handy. But again, thank you, Michaela, and thank you all for joining this presentation. And we look forward to hearing from you in the future. Take care.